from the studios of WFYI in Indianapolis, the first Indiana U.S. Senate debate, sponsored by the Indiana Debate Commission.
Good evening. Tonight, the Indiana Debate Commission brings you the first of two debates between the candidates for the U.S. Senate. I'm your moderator, Mizell Stewart. For the next hour, the candidates will answer questions from Indiana voters. They will also take a page from the historic Lincoln-Douglas debates and respond to each other. Tonight's broadcast is being carried live on radio and television stations throughout Indiana, on live web streams, and nationwide on C-SPAN. In keeping with the Indiana Debate Commission's mission of putting voters first, citizens will ask many of the questions tonight, most of them in person. Each candidate will have 1 minute to answer most of the questions. We will end with a final general question in which each candidate has 90 seconds for a closing statement. That describes the format. The candidates have been advised of the rules. Let me introduce the candidates to you now as they make their opening statements. They drew lots for their lectern placement and answering order, and we will begin with Democrat Joe Donnelly.
Thank you very much for having us here tonight. I want to thank the Commission, to our citizens who are here, and to Mr. Mourdock and Mr. Horning. You know, when I was raising our kids, my wife and I was able to coach them in basketball and baseball and track. And I asked them to give 100% and to play like a team. But nobody ever asked anybody on the team whether they were Republicans or Democrats. And that's the problem with Washington. This is about Republicans and Democrats. And it should be about America. That's why during my time in Congress, I voted for $2.4 trillion in spending cuts. I made sure that we had a vote for a balanced budget amendment that I worked with my good friend Bob Goodlatte on. Those are the kind of things I worked with Senator Lugar on the auto industry, so we could save over 100,000 jobs. Those are the things we need to do. It's not about right or left. It's about America.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Now to Richard Mourdock.
Good evening, and I'd also like to thank the Debate Commission, Congressman Donnelly, and Mr. Horning. You know, it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here tonight. This is part of American history. As we look at this long text of our nation's history, the final chapter has not yet been written, and each of us will have that chance to put a little mark on that chapter on November 6th. As we've toured Indiana over the last number of months, there's one thing that I've heard consistently, and that is the understanding that Washington is broken. 2/3 of Americans think that this nation is on the wrong track, and yet overwhelmingly Hoosiers are very proud of this state and know we are on the right track. You know, we come here tonight to talk about a lot of issues, but first and foremost, I think we will talk about principles, because I believe that many people go to Washington well-intentioned, but they compromise their principles in the name of partisanship. We're looking forward to this debate because we know this is an important election and we will help to change the course of America.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. And now to Andrew Horning for your opening statement.
Well, I thank you all as well. In fact, I thank you both for bringing up the issue of both partisanship in the United States and the history of the United States. If you look back to see how our founders fought against their own government and gave us warnings from George Washington all the way through about the kind of partisan bickering we see now, they would be appalled that we've divided ourselves into only two sides when you can get every kind of cup of cappuccino you can imagine. We need more choices than this in America. And what I see as a big problem facing us all is that none of us like the status quo. You've just pointed out that it's dysfunctional. You have an option to choose something different. Our founders fought their own government, the global superpower of the day. And all we have to do is go into air-conditioned comfort and press a button. I'm asking you to think about the power you have in the voting booth, but also the accountability. We already have what we've been choosing for the last 100 years. I think it's time to choose something different.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Now, let's go to questions from citizens. Megan Wood is a music education student from Indianapolis. Welcome, Megan, and go ahead with your question.
Thank you. The education system has never been perfect, but many educators and parents feel that we're headed in the wrong direction when it comes to funding and cutting programs. Please specify those programs that you believe are deserving and tell me why or what you will do to ensure that they receive adequate funding. In particular, will you support the funding of our arts programs?
The first response goes to Joe Donnelly.
Yes, I will, and I already have in Congress. And I've also supported Pell Grants, which are absolutely critical, especially to families with middle income, lower income. These Pell Grants are critical to our success. And on top of that, what we want to also make sure is that we have an education that works so that people can get training in the appropriate skills. Mr. Mourdock has said that he wants to abolish the Department of Education. Well, Pell Grants come through the Department of Education. I also voted to lower student loans to 3.4% from 6.8%. That also comes through the Department of Education. Our ability to compete as a state, our ability to compete as a country, depends on our educational level. And it's absolutely critical we fund education in the appropriate way.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Now to Mr. Mourdock.
It is true. I have called for the elimination of the Federal Department of Education, but I've not called for the elimination of those special grants and scholarships. I think they can be done a different way. But why would I make such an important claim that we should, in fact, abolish the Department of Education? Because I don't believe it's meeting what would be common sense metrics. Since the Education Department was founded, we've seen that, in fact, our education scores have gone down against international competition, and we've seen our dropout rates go up. While we've continued to fund, Mr. Donnelly, through the Congress, we continue to fund more and more of the Department of Education, we're sending more of our money to Washington and getting less back. In fact, the average employee of the U.S. Department of Education, including all the clerical staff, receives more than $100,000 a year in salary. That's more than twice what the average Hoosier teacher makes. Instead of sending Hoosier money to Washington, I think we ought to be keeping that money and, as always, letting schools be run at the local level and at the state level. I think it's a much better way to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. And now to Andrew Horning.
Well, from my standpoint, it's a fairly simple question. If we were running for an Indiana-based office, then there is an Article 8 in the Indiana Constitution that allows us to fiddle around with education. On the federal side, it is totally unconstitutional. I have a daughter that just went off to the University of Chicago. I know very well that this is a pretty expensive proposition, but what we have been doing is not working. And in fact, not only is it not working and unconstitutional, but the real issue here is that we have a tug of war between military-industrial complex and bankers, and whenever you have anything political, you have a pie that's going to be pulled at just like a tug of war rope. And just imagine who is going to win. If you follow the money, you look to see who's really funding campaigns. You look to see where the money is coming from. You're going to see that most of us are not on the winning side of this tug of war. I think it's time we change the rules. I think it should be we keep our paychecks and keep politics where it belongs.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Now we'll return to Mr. Donnelly for a 30-second rebuttal.
Sure. Those Pell Grants and those student loans at 3.4%, those are what makes it possible for many, many families to be able to go to school. And that comes through the Department of Education. And in addition, in regards to principle, it is not unprincipled to be bipartisan and to try to work with other people. Your principal is an unapologetic leader of the Tea Party movement, and that's fine. I would rather make sure that we can work together in Washington and in Indiana to move our country forward.
And now to Mr. Mourdock.
Well, I don't know that label of being the unapologetic Tea Party leader since I've been elected as a Republican on a number of occasions. But the simple fact is the Obama-Donnelly agenda, the Harry Reid agenda, that continues to put money into huge government bureaucracies without accountability is in error. You know, I think we ought to have the kind of accountability at the federal level that we have here at the state level, where we've managed so well that our credit rating has gone up instead of going down as it has under the Obama-Reid type of agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. Mr. Horning, 30 seconds.
I think you've seen, between the two on my right, exactly what's going to happen if you vote status quo again. It's always going to be a tug of war, and you're always going to lose. You know, we really have to change the rules here. You can do that with your vote. Our founders had to give up a lot more than just a vote. I think it's time that we use the power to actually overturn this government of ours that has become a crony network. We need a peaceful revolution to end this and put things back where they belong, with equal rights for all, everybody equal under law at last.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Our next question comes from Brian Kercheval. Brian is from Westfield and works in technical support. Thanks for joining us. What's your question for the candidates?
Thank you. Can you tell us how you'll work on tax reform? And do you also support the fair tax bill that's in Congress today?
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Mourdock.
Yes, thank you, Brian, as well for that question. I think almost certainly we're going to see some significant tax reform coming through the Congress, and we must. Our tax system is very badly broken right now, and it's far too punitive, and it's causing us not to create the kind of jobs we need to grow our economy. To the fair tax question, no, I do not support the fair tax because I don't think it's the best answer to America's problems, although I do believe a small part of our national tax should be from a national sales tax. You know, on the issue of taxes, though, I think it's very important that we be consistent. One of the things that's a real killer to Indiana jobs, and especially in agriculture, is the so-called inheritance tax. In Indiana, we've worked hard to put that on a program to phase it out of existence. Mr. Donnelly has come forward at one time to say he wanted to reduce the inheritance tax, and that would be a good thing to reduce the inheritance tax. However, the first time you had a chance to vote on it, to totally repeal it, to let it end, you voted instead to extend it. I don't think that kind of consistent or inconsistent policy is good for what we need to do to grow Indiana jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. Mr. Horning.
I've actually proposed the fair tax at both the state level and the federal level over many years. I started supporting it in the 1990s, and it's good to talk about that kind of overhaul because the fair tax would, in fact, fix a lot of the demographic problems we have with our Ponzi scheme programs in Medicare and Social Security. However, there are bigger problems than just taxation. We really have to address where the tax money goes, and that's where most of my effort would be expended because most of what we do at the federal level is unconstitutional, and when you have unconstitutional, unauthorized spending, it is in fact theft, and that's where I'd want to concentrate my efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Now to Mr. Donnelly.
I would support reducing the tax on small businesses and all businesses, corporations, to 25%. And what we're able to do by that is it's able to make our companies more competitive, and it will help us to be able to bring more businesses right back to our own country. And you mentioned the estate tax. And when you mention that, I support increasing the deductions to $5 million per person, $10 million per couple. You're going to wipe it out. I'd love to do that. We have a $16 trillion deficit caused by both parties. And to be in a place where you say we're going to wipe this out at the same time that we're trying to reduce our deficit, I'm all for eliminating the estate tax completely as soon as we get our balance back in budget. That seems to be the sensible thing to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donnelly. Let's return to Mr. Mourdock for a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, again, we see some inconsistency here. Mr. Donnelly is one of the key components of the Obamacare bill, came out early on, to your credit, to say that we ought not include a medical device tax as part of that bill. But then you voted for the bill that included that tax. Then you came back again to say, well, there shouldn't be there. Let's put a bill together to cancel the tax. And then again you voted for the approval, and now once again you're saying that we ought to do away with the medical device tax. Clearly we ought to do away with the medical device tax. We ought to do away with all of Obamacare. But to the broader point of the taxation, you are quite correct that we need to bring taxes down.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. Now to Mr. Horning, 30 seconds.
Well, you know, you have one voice to, you're going to be sending one person to Washington, D.C. for this seat. One voice in 100. Do you want it to be the same thing over and over again? Do you want to hear more of this bickering on both sides? It doesn't have to be this way. You know, if I were to be elected, first of all, it'd be a punch in the gut to the status quo. That'd be pleasant. That'd be fun. But the second thing is we would have new opportunities to look at new options. It's not always all one thing or all another. There are all kinds of ways to reach across between Democrats and Republicans that don't involve compromise.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Mr. Donnelly, on this question, you have the last word.
Well, in regards to the medical device tax, I've been thanked repeatedly by the companies for my work on that to try to reduce the taxes, to try to eliminate the medical device tax, and they have repeatedly thanked me for the hard work that we've put into that.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Sandra Herron owns a small consulting company here in Indianapolis. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Good evening, gentlemen. Performance research suggests that past performance is the best predictor of future success. Please share an example of a time you worked with someone with whom you disagreed politically to chart a solution to a complex problem.
Sandra, thank you very much. We will start with Andrew Horning.
Oh, sure. Start with the only guy that hasn't had public office yet. So, I guess I can't say from any sort of official position, but in my job every day, where I'm doing medical education work and working with medical devices all the time, I have to work with a lot of egos and a lot of issues where you're installing things, they don't always work out the way you would like. So I have handled lots of conflict in my job, in my life. I have kids, for goodness sakes. So I've done all of that. But I can't I can't really give you any, this is what I did when I was a congressman, because I've never been one. I do offer you that opportunity, though, and I'll tell you next time.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Now to Joe Donnelly.
I have kids too, and it is a challenge on occasion. But I've also had the chance to work with my colleagues. And I've worked with my friend Fred Upton, a Republican from Michigan, on getting a veterans center in South Bend, with Marlon Stutzman on saving our A-10 Air Force fighters in Fort Wayne, with the entire Indiana Republican congressional delegation and Mitch Daniels to make sure that we had a better highway road program for our state. It's the hallmark of my career, working together across aisles to make sure we get things done. It's not about Republican. It's not about Democrat. It's about America. And that's what these people have done, is work together with me because they believe the same thing. And our children and our children's children deserve our work on their behalf, not on behalf of a political party.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Now to Richard Mourdock.
Well, it is always important that we work together. And, I've been amazed in watching so many of the TV commercials. Congressman Donnelly would like to paint me as this person who can't work with others and is very harsh and cold, and I find that shocking. If that were true, I wouldn't see one of the most important things I've done as state treasurer is helping to set up a college savings plan that's increased by 10 times the number of people who are now saving for college, and I worked with Democrats to do that. As a county commissioner, I worked very hard to set up a welfare to work program so we could help people move from that welfare society into the work society, and I was the sole Republican among 2 Democrats when I carried that through. And last but not least, if I were the harsh person that Mr. Donnelly would paint me to be, I wouldn't have gotten the joy that I found working in the jungles of Bolivia with some of the poorest people on earth. In the Indiana State House, we've done a lot of work with Democrats. We saved the banking industry's protection of public funds by working with Democrats when they controlled the Indiana State House. So we've been very proud of that record, and we look forward to carrying it to the United States Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. Mr. Horning, 30 seconds for a comeback.
Well, I'd keep coming back to the same thing, I suppose. I don't know how you can support voting for the status quo again. We've been through this so many times where they use fear-mongering. Maybe our guy isn't so good this time, one party might say, but those other guys are so bad, we can't let them in. We really do need to shake this up. My fellow Hoosiers, it is really time to do something different with your vote. You can put a different voice into Washington, D.C., and I certainly would be that.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Now to Joe Donnelly.
We have a Mourdock versus Mourdock debate going on. They're not my words, they're yours, Richard. You're the one who said bipartisanship is Democrats doing what Republicans want them to do. You're the one who said you want to inflict your opinion on other people, and you're also the one who said the problem with Washington is too much bipartisanship. I couldn't disagree more. I think we need to work together to get things done.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. And on this question, Mr. Mourdock, you have the last word.
Well, I think you just argued with yourself. You sort of took me to task and then came back, Congressman, to say that you agreed. So to the point about bipartisanship, it is this bipartisanship that you said is so important in D.C. that it's caused us to see both parties come together to give us a $16 trillion national debt. I think that's disgraceful. I think we need to be saying that principle is more important here than partisanship, and far too often, unfortunately, we're seeing principle being compromised by partisanship. And I think that's something that we need to look at, because we can't just have people caving in due to the partisan pressure.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. Now we turn to the Lincoln Douglas segment of tonight's debate. I'll begin by asking each candidate to make a 1-minute statement about his beliefs on a particular issue. Then the other 2 candidates get 2 minutes each to rebut that statement. We will then return to the first candidate in the sequence to make a 1-minute response. We'll go for 3 rounds, giving each candidate the opportunity to take the lead. And now, let us turn to Joe Donnelly. You have 1 minute.
Thank you very much. One of the things we have to do is continue to work on jobs. It's the most critical thing of all to make sure everything goes right for our Hoosier state. And I worked with Senator Lugar to make sure we saved over 100,000 auto jobs. And he was a sterling partner and an incredible leader for our country. And you sent out a letter about Senator Lugar where you said he betrayed conservatives. And the word betrayed, just, you can disagree. But betrayed? I don't see how that even fits in the dialogue. We can disagree with each other. We can have different points of view. But that, I don't understand how you could say betray.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Now to Mr. Mourdock. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, to Senator Lugar, he is a good, honorable man, and we appreciate the fact that he said he's going to support us as we go forward. You know, to the point, though, that you're raising with, obviously, the Chrysler decision and the Chrysler case, let me make it very clear, because I know this is a major difference between you and I. We have sincere disagreement here, Congressman. I took on the fight with the interest of two groups of people in mind, the Teachers Retirement Fund of Indiana and the Indiana State Police Pension Fund. When the U.S. government set aside 150 years of bankruptcy law to take away the property of our retired teachers and our retired cops, someone deserved to stand up for them. They needed that. And I took an oath of office that said I would do that, and I'm proud that I've done that. You know, the bigger question is, though, why is it that under the Reid-Obama agenda, we continue to see government getting involved into more and more areas where it's picking winners and losers? I don't like the fact that government seems to ever be growing, and frankly, you've helped it do that, to get bigger and bigger. You know, I've made the statement here twice thus far this evening about the fact that our partisanship is now actually drowning out principle. And I believe, Congressman, that when you ran for office the first time, I believe you're an honest, principled person, but it was at that time that you said you were a fiscal conservative. And yet since then, you voted to raise the debt limit 7 times without ever calling for real fiscal accountability. You know, you said that you were against a national health care system. You said you were specifically against a Massachusetts-style system. You said you were against Obamacare. But then once you got back to D.C. and the pressure was on, your principles were caved and you went with the president on that message. I think those are the wrong things to do. I think that principled issue is what's really at stake here. And I stand with the principle that government has grown too big and costs too much.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. Mr. Horning, you
Well,
have
I guess,
2 minutes.
Since I'm kind of standing outside this debate kind of happily, which would be the case with the Senator Horning most of the time, I guess it's incumbent on me to interject some facts here that Republicans have zero history in cutting the size and cost of government. Zero. The last president actually to cut the cost of government was after Eisenhower. He gave us the biggest tax cut of all time at 2% of the gross domestic product, and he cut the size and cost of government, and that was JFK. Before that, the only constitutional president we had, probably the last one, was more or less Grover Cleveland. Now, there is zero opportunity for Republicans to say that they have any history or experience in cutting the cost of government. I am one of those people that really does admire Reagan's words, but his actions as a president, his administration, shows no history whatsoever of cutting the size and cost of government. What we have is both parties are really controlled by the same people that Eisenhower warned us about. Actually, Washington warned us about. 10 presidents in between those guys warned us about it. We have been warned about a system that grows too big for its pants. These men are honorable, good men, but they cannot fix this system. They are actually choosing to operate within the system, and as cogs of this machine, they cannot fix the machine. You, as voters, are going to have to do this. You have to make the decision to vote something different than the system. If you want to change things, Obama and Romney both agree, you can't change from within. I'm the guy on the outside of this argument. I would be the guy on the outside when it comes to the whole system of Washington being corrupt, and we all know that it's corrupt. There's only one thing to do here. You have one person you're going to send to Washington, D.C. as senator. One voice in 100 in 1/2 of the Legislative Assembly. On one hand, that's very little risk. On the other hand, it is a great opportunity, and I think you should take it.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. We are going to return to Mr. Donnelly to close this round out with the 1-minute statement.
The point I made was how inappropriate it is to use a word like betray with an American hero like Senator Lugar. And that's what's wrong with Washington, is it's all on the left or all on the right, and all they do is fight. When what we need to do is fix this country and work together to make sure that we can. And in regards to Chrysler, I'm proud to have stood with Senator Lugar, to have saved over 100,000 auto jobs, from Bedford to Fort Wayne to Kokomo, across our state. And Mr. Mourdock sued to try to force the liquidation of Chrysler. He says it was for the policemen and the teachers. The truth is that he turned down a settlement that was worth more than the lawsuit that he pursued. And so it was not about the policemen and the teachers. It was about Mr. Mourdock and his Tea Party agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Now we turn to Richard Mourdock to begin round 2 with the 1-minute statement.
Thank you. 4 years ago, Congressman Donnelly, you endorsed Barack Obama for President of the United States. You said at that time that you thought the president would put an end to the divisiveness in Washington. You said he would put an end to this partisanship that was there. You said that he would bring us all together, and you said that he would get the national economy going again. In fact, since then, we've seen personal incomes in the United States drop $4,300 per household. Healthcare costs go up $2,400 per family. We've seen the cost of gasoline go up 49%. Our national debt increase almost $6 trillion by 49%. And yet, I was surprised to hear just the other day, you've again endorsed President Barack Obama. Would you please explain why you think he's the right choice for America and even more the right choice for Hoosiers?
Next round, 2 minutes. Andrew Horning.
Well, I appreciate the fact that I could not possibly frame my argument as well as you guys are doing for me. I think the fact that we see this kind of partisan bickering every single election cycle is kind of endemic of what I saw when I ran as a Republican before. You can't fix this problem from within. You just can't do it. If you think about how many bureaucrats there are now, how many lobbyists who would lose their jobs if they actually solved the problems they claim to oppose, if you think about all the professional politicos, all the people who make their living off multi-million-dollar political campaigns, what do you get out of all of this process? What do you personally get by electing somebody after a campaign cost $20 million in out-of-state funding and direct campaign funding, and when trillions of dollars are at stake here and lives are at stake here? Our own children are being not only sent to wars overseas to protect us from guys with exploding underpants, but we've got a big issue in this country about actually mortgaging our children's future off. This is so wrong on so many levels that we've been doing this for so long. The last 100 years, we've been taking the wrong direction. We have allowed too many of the wrong people to take control of the government, and they're not the people on the ballot. These gentlemen, I think, are honorable. They have great intentions. They won't change anything. Neither one of them is capable of effecting that kind of change. We've had lots of people, from Senator Taft on the Republican side to Garfield on the Democrat side to Reagan. Ron Paul, one of my heroes, he can't fix his party. You can't do it. I saw what happened when I ran as a Republican. I saw what Ron Paul must have felt. I imagine you feel some of that yourself from within the Republican Party. You can't fight those guys. Look at the money. Follow it back to its source. Look to see how long these people have been involved in politics. On both sides, you're going to find sooner or later you get a lot of the same people funding both sides, because all they care about is whoever wins picks up the phone when they call.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. And now to Joe Donnelly.
4 years ago, we were losing over 800,000 jobs every single month. In the last 2.5 years, we've gained over 5 million jobs. The district I represent, in the northernmost county 4 years ago, unemployment was at 20%. The southernmost county, unemployment was at 20%. It is down in the neighborhood of 8% now. Is that perfect? No, it's not. The unemployment rate has gone under 8% for the first time since February of 2008, under a Republican administration. But this isn't about Republicans or Democrats. This is about our country. This is about jobs. And you, Mr. Mourdock, single-handedly could have sunk Indiana's economy and put us into a recession if you were fortunate enough for you, unfortunate enough for us, to have been successful in your lawsuit in regards to Chrysler. And you look at that, and it takes your breath away when you know these families and you see what they've gone through. And to have talked to them on the day when the Supreme Court decided not to hear your appeal. And to be with them, where as they talk to you, they say, Joe, if Mr. Mourdock is successful, I could lose my house, I'll lose my job for sure, and I don't even know what we're going to do for the future. That's the choice you put on the families of all the auto companies in this state. I stood with workers, and always will. And I said I would vote for the president because he stood with those workers then as well. But I am just as happy to work with a Governor Romney. And if Governor Romney is the president, I will do the same as I did with President Bush, which was I always wanted George Bush to be an extraordinary success because it's about America. And if the president is successful, we're successful.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Mourdock, you have 1 minute.
Congressman Donnelly, I cannot understand for the life of me why, in fact, you would again want to support someone who has not caused our economy to improve, but to get worse. You know, when you voted for the stimulus program, you said that it would create 78,000 jobs in Indiana. In fact, we've had a net loss of 8,800 jobs as of March of this year. It is true that for the first time, our unemployment rate this past month came below 8% for the first time in 43 months. But our debt has increased. That's a debt, not that you and I should talk about in the abstract, but it's a real debt on the children and grandchildren that all of us have. This is wrong what we've been doing, and we need to get government back on track as we've done in Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. And now for round 3 of the Lincoln Douglas segment, we'll start with Andrew Horning. You have 1 minute.
Well, I suppose I could summarize it up by saying, why would anybody vote for the status quo again? If I were a voter at this point, you should be angry. Why aren't we more angry with the choices that we've been handed for the last 100 years? Now, I can say personally that I've not voted for anybody who's won in the last 30 years, so I guess I can say at least you can't blame me for any of this stuff, because I vote for losers. But my gosh, my friends, when we are looking at this current status quo, we have the world's highest percentage of citizens in prison. We have, the land of the free shouldn't have the world's highest percentage of citizens in prison, but the home of the brave. My gosh, we've given up all of our liberties because of our fear of guys overseas that we have united through our foolish foreign policies. When are we going to get wise that the status quo is not working? How do you defend working with this status quo to change the status quo when nobody's been able to do this in 100 years?
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Now to Joe Donnelly.
I'd like to mention one thing that Mr. Horning said, and that is in regards to our foreign policy. Osama bin Laden is dead. Our young men and women are home from Iraq. I was in Iraq a number of times, and I've been in Afghanistan a number of times as well. And there's no more solemn duty than to spend time with our troops or with their parents. And we are working right now to have our young men and women come home from Afghanistan. And when they do, we need to make sure that they have a job here in Indiana. One of the families I know up in Kokomo, it's the Love family. Rhody Love, extraordinary lady. And Rhody's son, who served in Afghanistan, served protecting our country. Rhody's son now works at the transmission plant in Kokomo. And when I was in Afghanistan, over by the Pakistan border, one of the toughest places you'd ever want to see on the face of the earth. And I was with the Indiana National Guard, pride of our state, amazing people. And I met with them and said, what's the most important thing I can do for you? And I'm thinking they're going to tell me, Joe, we need better vests, we need trucks. They said, no, Joe, we need a job when we get home. That's the most important thing we can do. And that's what my time in Congress has been focused on, and what my time as a U.S. Senator will be focused on. Continuing to create more jobs for our state, more opportunities for our state. That's what's critical. More jobs, more opportunities, and ending the dysfunction in Washington of the Tea Party right and the extreme left, and doing what's right for our country instead of focusing on politics.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Now, Mr. Mourdock, you have 2 minutes.
Well, we certainly agree, Congressman Donnelly, on the point of view as to what our young men and women are doing overseas. Even as we stand here tonight, I have a niece and her husband both serving in Afghanistan, so believe me, we do share those concerns. They are quite genuine. We need to make sure that as America goes forward in the 21st century, that whenever the call comes that we must put our young men and women in the field, that they go forward with the Defense Department that can back them up to make sure they never, ever enter a fair fight. We always have to make sure the Defense Department is well funded in that regard. But to the broader point, and it is a good one, as to whether or not people will have jobs when they come back from overseas, that is especially critical in light of what's going on in Washington and the fact that you've again endorsed President Obama. His policies have not worked. I thought they were going to have a balloon drop and a confetti drop when they announced 7.8% unemployment the other day. That's not acceptable, Congressman. We shouldn't see that as a new normal that somehow is what is good enough for us. You know, as we continue to go forward, here we are on October 15th. Not a single Hoosier small businessman or small businesswoman can tell you on October 15th what their taxes will be, what their tax rate will be come January, what their health care cost will be come January, what the regulatory environment will be come January, because the federal government, and you're right on this as well, is failing. It has absolutely failed because Congress cannot come together to put a consistent message out, and Harry Reid won't even bring a bill up to vote for an agenda and a budget in the U.S. Senate for 3 years. For 3 years. And it's broken because we see that type of partisanship, and we're sending the message to businesses that keep them from investing, and that's a dangerous thing, especially when we have so many young people who do want to come back here for jobs. And if I were the U.S. Senator, I would be talking about it and making the point of it every single day.
Mr. Mourdock, thank you very much. Let's close out with Andrew Horning. 1 minute.
Well, of course, the question was not at all answered. I was asking for a defense of the status quo, and of course, what I heard instead was dysfunction. And that is pretty much underlining, exclaiming, and bolding my point. I do appreciate you guys put a highlighter to the point here, but really, the issue for voters is fairly simple. At this point, we have status quo or not status quo. You can see a guy who's been funded by, $2,000 some odd dollars, with just independent folks pitching in a few bucks here and there. You got a candidate who's got a regular day job, and then you've got a couple of people who make their living off politics and have for quite some time, and have millions of dollars. Do we suppose those millions come without strings? What I'm asking you for is to consider that this is just the same as every election cycle that I've ever witnessed, and as far as I can tell in history, the same as every election cycle. Fear-mongering, pointing out the errors of the other guys and saying, I'll do better because what? Because what? What are we actually looking for in these votes?
Thank you very much. Now, let's return to questions from Hoosier voters. Jacob Isaac joins us tonight from Crawfordsville. He's a graduate student. What's your question for the candidates?
Good evening, gentlemen. Many voters are increasingly disengaged with the political process over what they see as politicians putting partisan politics over positive results. Voters get browbeaten with negative campaign ads, constantly telling us what another candidate is doing wrong. However, if you want to connect with me as a voter, you have to be willing to openly be the bigger person. I would like for each of you to take a moment and name one policy stance from each of your competitors that you agree with and explain why.
And gentlemen, we're going to give you a little more time to answer this question. So we'll go with 2 minutes each, and we'll start with Joe Donnelly.
I agree with Richard's policy on the college plan. I think it's important for every student in our state to have a chance to go to college. This is something that is so absolutely critical. Your ability to be employed is directly related to your opportunity to get a good education. And so that's why I think that things like the reduced student loans is critical. That's why I think things like Pell Grants are critical as well, because it enables families who may never have been able to send their kids to school before to have a chance to do it now. And that child has the opportunity to change the face of Indiana and to change the face of the United States of America. So I think that's a good program. And in regards to Andrew, I have had a wonderful time with Andrew traveling the state, being at events together from New Harmony, Indiana to Fort Wayne, Indiana, where we talked with voters, we spent time with voters, and Andrew has a deep love for our state, a deep conviction about his views and his issues, and the willingness to mix it up and to get out there. And it's been a great time traveling around the state with you. I remember we were in New Harmony, where we spent time talking issues with all the voters in Posey County. And probably one of the best ice cream socials we ever had as well.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Now to Mr. Mourdock.
Well, let me start off as well with the Libertarian to my left. You know, I certainly appreciate and always have the Libertarian point of view because I think it does bring a good argument. And I'm okay with the Libertarian Party certainly being out there to offer a choice. You didn't just walk up and put your name on the ballot. You had to go out and get 500 signatures in each of the 9 congressional districts, just as Congressman Donnelly and I did. That does reflect well on your commitment to the process. Certainly in my own background, I'll confess, I voted for a few libertarians in days gone by because I do believe that constitutional approach is so very important. And that's in part why I took the position I did in the Chrysler case, as you and the Libertarian Party know. You know, I stood up for the rule of law. If the government can change the law at a whim, when they determine there to be a crisis, that's not a good thing. When they say one group of Americans is better than another and pick a winner and loser, we no longer have equal justice under the law if some are more equal than others. And I think the Libertarian Party consistently stands with that. To Congressman Donnelly, I will say that from what I understand of your policies on immigration, I think we are very much the same. I think we have both called to make sure the border is made more secure, more solid. And I believe that we stand together in saying there ought to be a way for those who are here illegally today to report themselves so that they're somehow getting some access, and as they start to obey the laws, that they might check back in through a system which would allow them to somehow get a worker visa. You know, I think those types of things are good programs, and I believe that is your position. If I'm wrong, I'm sure you will correct me.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. And now to Mr. Horning.
Well, trying to get politicians to say something nice about each other was a cruel trick, that was. But, you know, I guess I can say pretty honestly as a libertarian that I agree with a lot of both of what they've been about for quite some time. And in fact, I remember when I ran as a Republican, I couldn't go to any Lincoln Day dinner without seeing you, Mr. Mourdock. You're pretty much everywhere all over the state and have been for quite some time. So as far as the hard work and what they've been doing for the last several years, I certainly appreciate that. But I also hope you appreciate that I come from an entirely different paradigm than the other guys do, in so much as when they offer government as a solution, I see that as a problem. So whenever something comes up where, you know, when he says something's constitutional, not constitutional, I appreciate the fact that he's making constitutional something other than a bad word, because it used to be, you know, people used to think of it as a musty old document. And I certainly don't flinch whenever somebody says he's a Tea Party candidate, because the Tea Party, I'm disappointed that they've become just another vessel for the Republican Party, it seems, but I know an awful lot of great people who are supporting him over me. And while I should take that personally, I suppose, I get it, and I think he's a good guy. And as far as Mr. Donnelly over there, I have to say I have had nothing but pleasant interaction with him. In fact, his campaign staff has been very pleasant and friendly. I don't know if we want to go out and have a beer afterwards or not, but this is a good man. And I think both of these guys are honorable. It's just I operate on a different paradigm, and I chose not to operate as a cog within the machine. I am fighting the whole machine that these guys represent. And so while I certainly have nothing bad to say about them, and I appreciate everything they've done, I do have a big problem with what they do choose to represent. I had made the same mistake myself once before. I've done lots of things I regret, but having seen the inside of that machine and having lived to tell you about it, I got to tell you, you don't want to vote for the status quo again.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. Aaron Williford works in lawn care and joins us tonight from Kokomo. Aaron, let's hear your question for the candidates.
Thank you. Yes, gentlemen. A tough question to answer in such a short time, but would you state your summary view on the fundamental nature and the proper role of government?
Gentlemen, we'll give you a minute, 30 seconds for this question, and we'll start with Richard Mourdock.
Well, I think it's a very great question. It's one that we need to examine every 2 years when we have federal elections. Clearly, I think the role of government is best defined in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. Those so-called enumerated powers that are there are very specific in limiting what the federal government can do. You know, now, does that mean that everything that the federal government has the proper authority to do, is that specifically listed under 18 items? No, I do not believe that. But I know Mr. Donnelly's tried to make the point, tried to attack me, because I was once asked if, in fact, the Constitution included the words Social Security and Medicare, and clearly it does not. And I gave that answer, and he runs that in a news clip, or a commercial rather, to make it sound like I believe the idea of Social Security is unconstitutional. And Joe, you know I've never said that. Just because that's not in the Constitution, neither is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, neither is the FBI, but that hardly means that such things are beyond the scope of modern day government. We do, though, have to make sure that government lives within its means. You know, here in Indiana, we've been on the right track because we've lived within our budget. And that's totally different than what the federal system has become. And Congressman Donnelly, when you voted to raise the debt limit now 7 times, I think you've gone against what is an instinctive principle within you, and I commend you for it. But you said you were a fiscal conservative once, but again, I think that's where your principles have succumbed to the partisanship of D.C., and I think that's unfortunate.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. Now to Mr. Horning, you have 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Well, that was one of the best questions that can be asked of anybody at any time. That's a very pivotal question. And I guess I also have to say, Mr. Mourdock, that your answer was one of those things that makes me blanch when people say you're a constitutionalist. Because you think about both Indiana and federal constitutions have something like the 10th Amendment in them. Article 1, Section 25 is probably the best worded out of the Indiana Constitution. But basically, to summarize, if it isn't in the Constitution, if it's not authorized specifically by the Constitution, it is prohibited by the Constitution. So most of what we call government, and most of what these gentlemen have proposed, most of what our government has done for the last 100 years, is clearly unconstitutional. Now, we can change the constitutions if we like. There's a process for amending them. And I have several amendments that I would probably propose myself should I get the opportunity. But the fact is, the law is the law. And the law as it exists right now in both state and federal constitutions is nothing like the government that we have now, or nothing like either of these gentlemen are proposing we continue. This is a really clear case where the role of government is clearly defined in print, but to summarize, it is only to protect our rights and our bodies as described in the Constitution from external interference, not to protect us from ourselves. It is to protect our contracts and our rights. As far as the rest of what our government does, it is all unconstitutional. If you want to change the constitutions, okay, but let's at least be legit about this.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. And now, Joe Donnelly, you have 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Get to the scope in just 1 second. But, you know, Richard, I may have been born at night, but I wasn't born last night. And when you meet with the Madison Tea Party and you say to them, you show me where in the Constitution it allows Medicare, and you show me where in the Constitution it allows Social Security. We're not that dumb. We know what you were implying, and we know what you're driving at. And you also said that Medicare should be turned into a voucher system. Well, for our seniors, that voucher system, that'll cost you $6,200 right out of your own pocket. And now you tell me how many of our seniors have the ability to have an extra $6,200 lying around in their house. In regards to the scope of government, it should be as small as we can possibly make it. But what we want to make sure is that we stay out of the way of our entrepreneurs, that we enable them to have success, that we provide things like R&D tax credits, make that permanent. Make sure that for our small businesses we have advanced expensing so they can go buy equipment and buy machinery. Our job is to try to stay out of the way as much as possible and let everybody succeed. And if things get extraordinarily difficult, the government is there to try and be of some help.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Mike Rosiello is a lawyer and United Way volunteer from Zionsville. Mr. Rosiello, please go ahead with your question.
Good evening. The poverty rate in Indiana and the economic challenges in Indiana have increased. Which specific federal human service programs would you maintain, and which specific programs would you reduce or reform? Or put another way, what part of the safety net would you work to maintain, and how?
And our first response goes to Andrew Horning. You have 1 minute.
Well, I will be bold and libertarian and say that just about everything must go. Now, looking at our debt, looking at how we've hawked our children's future for our present comforts, we have a moral issue here. It's not moral that we have put our children in debt so that we can be comfortable today. That's just not right. Now, there are all kinds of ways to deal with the safety net issue, and it used to be done in this country through churches and fraternal organizations that their voluntary collection plate was outcompeted by the IRS, of course, whose collection plate is not voluntary. I mean, obviously, we have problems with an unsustainable system of government now. And if you're looking at the hard numbers, there's no getting around the fact that Medicare is one of the biggest things that's generating our debt. Just our money system alone is also another one, but just in terms of safety net issues, oh my gosh, I don't know where to begin with this. Have they worked? Have they worked? If you're looking at whether these things have actually worked over time, you'll see that there was a time when we actually were, the difference between rich and poor was much less than now.
Thank you, Mr. Horning. And now to Joe Donnelly.
Well, first, the Department of Agriculture. We had a farm bill. I voted for I wanted to vote for the farm bill, but we couldn't get it to the floor because of partisan bickering, primarily because the Tea Party folks didn't want to allow a vote. And the farm bill had $16 billion in nutrition cuts, but it still provided enough nutrition funding so that our students could get decent lunches, so that when they came back to school after a weekend, where they may not have had anything to eat the entire weekend, they were able to get something decent to eat. And it also reduced the deficit by $23 billion. Those are the kind of programs that can work, that take care of our children and reduce the deficit at the same time.
And Richard Mourdock, 1 minute.
I think it is regrettable. I will agree with Congressman Donnelly that there wasn't a vote taken on the farm bill. Clearly 82% now of that farm bill is simply about these types of programs, the food programs, the assistance programs, and I think that is a question that needs to be dealt with in a better fashion. But to the comment of a moment ago, even that Mr. Horning made about the morality and what's right, let's go back to where we see government going today. And, even that last question about making government smaller, Mr. Donnelly, you voted for Obamacare. You can't make government bigger than to vote for something like Obamacare. And we talk about the poor and the needy and the elderly. It was Obamacare and that bill that you voted for that took $716 billion away from Medicare. And I know that Democrats like to say, oh, we really didn't take it away. Yes, you did. The money was taken away that was going to go to doctors to take care of patients on Medicare. And I think that was a bad move. To say that you believe in limited government and yet support something as massive, the biggest tax increase in American history, the biggest growth ever, is wrong.
Your time's expired. Thank you very much. Now to our final question. Gentlemen, if you are sent to Washington, what is the most important thing you believe needs to be done to serve the good of Hoosiers back home and in the bigger picture in the nation as a whole? We'll start with Joe Donnelly, and you have 90 seconds.
Thank you. And first and foremost, just to say, that $716 billion, Mr. Mourdock, you take that out in your own budget. We put it into patient care. You give it out in tax breaks and don't reduce the deficit at all. But as to what we can do for our state, this is the most extraordinary place. And it works best when Hoosiers are working. When mom or dad have a job, that's the best social program of all. So my focus will be on job creation, job opportunity through good education, tax credits, going after China so they can't cheat and steal our jobs anymore, making sure that we have American energy so we're doing oil exploration and we have American energy coming from every source, including ethanol. And Mr. Mourdock, ethanol is actually a good thing, and an ethanol standard is a good thing as well. What we have to do is grow jobs. We have to make sure in Washington we work together. That's my history. I'm just Joe. I work with both teams. I don't care if you wear an R uniform or a D uniform. I wear an American uniform. And so to all of you, I say this. What's most important is that we make our country stronger and we leave for our children and our grandchildren an even better, greater America. That's what I'll work for every day, and that's the promise I give you as your United States Senator. Thank you so much for the chance to be with you here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. And now to Richard Mourdock.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Congressman Donnelly and Mr. Horning for being here tonight, and again, thank the Commission. As we go forward into this next few weeks and months, there's much to discuss. But I am one who's absolutely convinced that the federal government is on the wrong track. I entered this race with one principle, and that was that government has grown too big and it costs too much. I think Washington is that place where principles get crushed and get compromised by partisanship. Again, I believe Congressman Donnelly is a fair, honorable person, but when he has said as a candidate he's against earmarks and then boasts of getting them, that's not consistent. When he says that he's against Obamacare and then votes for it, that's not consistent. When he says he wants to reduce the inheritance tax and then votes to extend it, that's not consistent. Issue by issue, principle says you stand for what you believe and you do it consistently. As we go forward, we know, because I've spoken to so many Hoosiers, you are convinced that Indiana is on the right track, and we are. We live within our budget. We operate in such a way we've actually made government smaller. We've paid down our debt, and exactly the opposite has occurred at the federal level. We see every single American now burdened with a $52,000 debt, even that new child who was born yet today, because, again, he said he was a fiscal conservative, but Mr. Donnelly's voted 7 times to raise the debt limit. It's time we can do better. I'm running for United States Senate to make sure we run Washington, D.C. the way we've been managing here in Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Mourdock. And now to Andrew Horning. You have 90 seconds.
Well, as far as all of the partisan stuff that you've heard these gentlemen allude to, I agree with it absolutely, and I'm asking voters to fix it. There's only one way to fix it. Stop voting for only 2 parties. We have to get another voice in this somehow. You're voting, remember, just one voice in 100 in one half the Legislative Assembly is not that much of a risk. Just vote for me just once, just once. You can always fire me later. But let me just get on to what I would do specifically. If you look at horningforsenate.com, you'll find all kinds of specifics about what I think the Constitution says. I've got annotated versions of both the Indiana and U.S. Constitutions. And yes, a U.S. Senator is supposed to defend the Indiana Constitution against the federal government. I agreed with Mr. Mourdock when he talked about issues with the 17th Amendment, for instance. Now, I guess I have to say, too, though, that what I propose is devolving let me reverse that, evolving away from our dependence on government. I have proposed lots of means to get us off these monkey traps of Social Security and Medicare. There are ways to do it. There are free market ways. There are all kinds of voluntary associations that could pick up the slack. There are government means to do this. But what we're doing now is numerically not working. It was a cynical attempt to begin with, if you remember just Social Security. When that was devised in 1935, the average life expectancy of a white woman was 65. We expected people would die before they used this stuff. And now that the numbers are not working out, we have to come up with other means to protect our elderly and our sick.
Thank you very much, Mr. Horning. And thank you for watching tonight's U.S. Senate debate, sponsored by the Indiana Debate Commission. Our thanks to the candidates and the voters who traveled here to take part. Special thanks to WFYI for providing facilities and production support. We also appreciate the assistance of our affiliate organizations and volunteers for making this possible. The next in the Commission's series of gubernatorial debates will be held Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern at the DeBartolo Performing Arts Center in South Bend. On behalf of the Indiana Debate Commission, I'm Mizell Stewart. Good night.